You're listening to Overwatch Contenders Daily, your path to daily news, scores, and insights into the Overwatch League stars of tomorrow. Here's your host, LemonKiwi.
Overwatch fans, hope you're having a wonderful start to your week. It's Monday. This means it's Overwatch Contenders Daily time, and I'm LemonKiwi. Our names kind of rhyme with the show, but I have a great interview for you today. The Australian Contenders wrapped up their finals. This means every region has crowned their winner. It's insane. It's a long season of Contenders, and it's already over, but I've brought on legacy coach and overall Australian analyst and mastermind, no pun intended. It's Racquet. You know him as Alexander. Maybe you know him as Racquet. He's going to come on today to talk about the Australian semifinals and final that wrapped up on Friday night, at least in my time zone. Australian is just way down the line from me. But in terms of Contenders news, well, like I said, Contenders has wrapped up all their finals. So I'll be going into Open Division and trials coming up, maybe some AMAs from players you know and love, but there is no news. Let's get right into my interview with Racquet about the Australian finals. And I'm here with Racquet, or Alex, but you know him as the coach of Legacy. He's also overall an amazing analyst for the Australian scene. And to be honest, I don't know that much about so many of the scenes of Contenders, but that's why I bring these amazing guests on to tell me all about it. But in case you guys missed it, this weekend, Australia wrapped up their semifinals and finals on Friday, and on the side of the brackets, on the one side of the bracket for the semifinals, Sydney Drop Bears versus Dark-Sided. That was a tight match. And on the other side of the bracket, got Masterminds versus Blank Blue. And I spoke to Avril, if you guys remember a little bit of the quarterfinals interview that I had, where it seemed to be an agreeable prediction that Blank Blue and Dark-Sided should have been in the finals, but that was not at all the case. So, Racquet, I gotta say, how's it going, and how were those matches to start out?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. Having a nice warm coffee. It's midday, so as I said, in Australia, the cold is actually our kryptonite. So
it's hot
that's why
here, so
that's why I look like a lost Viking at the moment. But you know what? The Contenders that warmed me up truly. Because having some good matches for our scene, probably the best competition we've ever had. Obviously, Contenders has really raised the bar for us, and happy to break it down.
Well, you're going to break it down for all of the viewers that are not from Australia, or even from the tight-knit fans from Australia, and this was some of the best matches your community has seen. But let's start on the semi-final match between Dark-Sided versus Sydney Drop Bears, where I learned that Drop Bears is an aggressive koala or something. I didn't even know what a Drop Bears was before watching this, but let's start with that match. The match went into Game 5, where I don't know if you guys remember, I interviewed Avril in the quarterfinals, where he said that Drop Bears or Dark-Sided should have been the one to go to the finals. One of the strongest teams in the regular season, 18-2 map count, undefeated. So, Racquet, in your coach's opinion, what went wrong with Dark-Sided, or what went so right with Drop Bears?
Certainly is quite an interesting question, and to sort of put this into perspective storyline-wise, these two teams were the only two teams competing on land that participated in a boot camp. So, if we're talking about player synergy, feeling familiar with each other, these two teams probably have the best out of the four teams participating at the Contenders land, because, boot camp can be incredibly important. Despite my team, Legacy, not making it to land, we had a boot camp, but it certainly did help. Now, putting that into perspective into coming into this match as well, in my opinion, I feel like Dark-Sided slightly underperformed, and you had certain situations in the match where I felt like that was shown, especially on Hollywood, I believe, and they had a lot of nerves issues coming onto here as well. Now, Drop Bears, they looked very, very confident, and surprisingly so, because they have two very new players onto their roster with a Kraken and Bertlog, two support players who pretty much haven't been solidified on a top roster ever. So for them to come into this LAN and perform the way they did, I mean, when you're panning onto the cameras, you could see that a Kraken was like shaking, and it was holding that
oh god,
that thing that keeps your hands warm all the time. But surprisingly, they seem to really come out in the clutch there. But here's the thing. Darksided, I think, are the more consistent team, and talking to their players and coming into this, and especially on the desk, they really nailed this point down. If you try to focus one element of Drop Bears, then they're going to have another element that completely surprises you. And I think that really suits to their name, Drop Bears, right? They're very surprising. They come out with some very surprising strategies. And I think one thing that a lot of people maybe overlooked coming into this tournament was the way that they played Junkrat compositions. And that was their most successful map win, right? It was on Hollywood where they ended up holding Darkside on that first point. Now, one thing that I found very awkward about the Hollywood specifically, because this was the most dominant win in the series, right? So it was a 3-2. Hollywood was the one where Drop Bears ended up getting a full hold. And surprisingly, because Darksided are a team that don't really mind running the pharmacy, they don't mind running a Pharah, and they decided to run a Genji into a Junkrat dive composition on that defense, which isn't necessarily bad, but it doesn't suit the Darksided playstyle. I mean, Termo isn't notorious for his Genji play. He's much more comfortable on that Pharah, and for them to elect to run full dive into that, I think was a little bit questionable considering their playstyle preference and the way that they've been wanting to deal with Sombra throughout the whole series as well, picking Pharah and trying to burst down. They could have applied that same logic onto the Junkrat, just spam out the cafe on Hollywood and then send the Tracer around back to try and get some picks. And, you know, talking to their players afterwards, they sort of thought that as well. They sort of thought maybe they should have picked it on the fly. They should have adapted. And I know during that series, their players, especially, I believe, Swarko, one of the pause breaks that ended up happening during the series was because he had to stand up and get away from the stage because he had pins and needles. He couldn't move, his arms or legs at a particular time. So that was really unfortunate there for Darksided, but it just shows how a lot of teams and analysts like me undermined Drop Bears coming into this tournament. And when you undermine a team that has so much individual talent, they're really going to crush you.
Well, I think it was Avril or somebody on the desk said that Darksided have been cursed with the second place no matter what Australian tournament they go in. Of course, everything other than Contenders, they get hit with the second place. They can't get higher than that. And Contenders should have been, or the Finals playoffs should have been the tournament that they would get first place. And then they get struck with getting knocked out in the semis. But wow, to deal with nerves to that level when you have so much tremendous experience behind the scenes that you'd have to step off the land stage. But I don't know how much experience or how many lands Australia get. But you mentioned Sydney Drop Bears. They're heavily let's say underestimated maybe by the rest of the teams, and it seemed to me that from what I've been hearing, what I've been seeing, that they strategize heavily around Sombra meta or Sombra play style, relying on Billa on that Sombra particularly. So he's been said to be one of the scariest Sombras in Australia. So do you agree with that? And is that part of why they were so strong in the playoffs?
Yeah, that certainly is, because Sombra is the sort of that type of hero now. Actually, before LAN came over, of course, LAN was on a different patch. I believe it was the patch afterwards where Sombra received the slight nerf in that if you attempt to hack and you get shot, like there's a small cooldown period there, but they still proceeded to run it because they felt like it really suited their identity. I mean, this is a team that really excels on leaping on wounded targets, and I feel like if they're running that Sombra, that really accelerates that win condition that they constantly go for, right? They have a DPS player that's very proactive, and if you can put him on a hero like Sombra, you instantly insert a win condition that a team that is very, very fast and cohesive like Sydney Drop Bears, I think it's a no-brainer to have them on that Sombra comp all the time because they're very, very quick on collapsing, especially this was said on the desk as well. You have so many different threats on that team that step up in different scenarios. We can look at the primary two that everyone's been saying, right? In that Billa and Quats are the two primary threats of that team, but you also have outside factors like a Kraken was incredibly consistent. He was getting picks before a lot of these fights, contesting Molotov, who is considered one of the best Zenyatas in the region. We have Jordation, who is a complete wild card in a lot of these matchups because you can have him sometimes contesting the best DPS in the region, and he can really pop off on some maps. And if you have that in conjunction with Billa, all of a sudden you're very, very scared of your backline and the fact that it could die very quickly. You have Shogo, who I believe is probably very underrated coming into this as well, because we saw on several maps, this guy came up with several 2Ks on his self-destructs. He was incredibly consistent, and he really pulled out in the clutch in a lot of these matches. So you have this very, very solid core in Billa and Quartz, but you also have a lot of players that come when the moment is needed, and that is really important when coming, especially in a LAN as well. And so when they have this Sombra, when you have a hero that disables enemies and enables your own teammates, this gave Drop Bears, a very aggressive team, a lot more space to work with. And Billa must... Now this is sort of theory crafting. I'm not 100% sure on this, but Sombra is a hero that does require a lot of comps. So if they are deciding to run this Sombra composition, I would maybe predict that Billa has sort of a role within comms, because it's so important to play off your Sombra player, because that Sombra is going to be the one who's going to be kicking off the fights when you hack a target, right? So they have to be really quick on that, and I assume Billa has quite a good process in this. And they used to have a player called Face on the team who has been moved to coach, and he's really bolstered the Sombra play, the whole play of Drop Bears in general, and they played fantastically in this series, and their Sombra compositions was one of the main reasons why they went through. I thought Darksided actually played reasonably well against the Sombra throughout the whole series, but once again, you have multiple threats on the team that can rise upon any occasion.
And it coming down to the final game 5 out of how hard both of these teams fought. And yes, Drop Bears brought their Sombra, and then Darksided brought their own, and switching these different compositions. It was very, I think, surprising to the desk, and we could almost say it was an upset that Drop Bears got to the finals. And this moves on to our second semifinal match of Masterminds versus Blank Blue, which ended in a 3-1 in favor of Masterminds, and again, considered an upset, to no offense to anybody, but going to that semifinal match, the casters and I think everybody predicted that Blank Blue would move forward. They're a very young team, lots of potential. Even said that at their highest capacity, they're almost undefeatable. But this, like I said, series ended up 3-1. So could you tell us what happened, Blank Blue?
This is actually very intriguing, because once again, we have a sort of unique storyline for both of these teams coming into it, much like the other side of the bracket. These two teams are both LAN winners previously. So they should have, theoretically, a reasonably good idea of how LAN plays out, accustomed to the environment, especially Blank Blue, because they actually played at this venue before at one of the ESL tournaments. So coming into this, I thought that could definitely play into Blank Blue's hand. In saying that, one thing that a lot of people, especially me, didn't really go through in terms of Masterminds is that their playstyle against Blank Blue could potentially be favorable in the way that they play. What do I mean by that? Blank Blue, there are two main factors that circled into this series for Masterminds to have this victory. And I think the first one is that Masterminds have a very unique playstyle with their support players. Now, of course, Dalsu, who was previously on Masterminds, didn't attend this event. Taki replaced him there. But the one support player that really adjusts the playstyle of Masterminds and that puts them in a very good situation against Blank Blue, I think, is Cantus, because he's a support that has a playstyle that is very unique in that he will either flank or he will hide in the backline, and you wouldn't be able to find him whatsoever. And I think, and certainly in this series, he was playing a little bit more defensively, because Blank Blue are a team that really like to go for your backline supports. This is a team that goes and hard dives and wants to kill your supports instantly at the start of a fight. And if you remove that win condition out of the equation by pretty much getting 2 orbs in with Cantus on the Zenyatta, then moving out of the fight and hiding, then they're trying to dive, and then they get lost in the middle of a team fight, and then all of a sudden, Gob, their main tank, starts falling down quicker because just before the dive came in, he's discorded, and they end up chunking him down real bad. Now, combining this as well with the aspect that Blank Blue were actually adding a few more flavors in this series, and Blank Blue is a team that notoriously within our scene just plays hard dive. They just play a bunch of Winston, Genji, Tracer. Sometimes they add a little bit of Widow, but that's pretty much the extent that you're going to see of this team. They do want to run more comps, tank comps. but they don't really choose to. They feel like that is really their strength card. But coming into this, the most surprising thing is, like, the word out there was that they were practicing a lot more Sombra. They ended up, playing, I believe, with Blank from the Pacific region, because, they're related in that sense, and they got to practice a lot of their comps. So this was for about a week, I believe. And then coming into Contenders, they wanted to transition that information that they got from the Blank from the Pacific region, who came second, I believe, trying to put that style into their own sort of condition, I guess. And I think it is sort of unique because it isn't too much time to play such a composition. And maybe I honestly think that was the wrong choice coming into it, because I thought the hard dive comps were really, really good. But the thing is that up against Masterminds, is that necessarily the best thing? And it was unique that they decided to have more cards in this series and that they were playing a lot more Sombra. They were playing comps that they haven't really played too much before in terms of, on the grand stage of Contenders, right? So it was a unique plan to attempt to, flex their hero pool in that regard. And I know they certainly can do it, but there's a difference between, this player can play a particular hero, but can the team play around that player? The chemistry is so important when they're running these compositions. The Sombra comp that they elected to run on Lijiang, Micro, who is usually their Genji player, he was getting EMPs very quick. It's because he's a very good mechanical player. But the thing is, from knowing Micro, he's actually quite a quiet player. So in terms of following up on these EMPs, how quick is that going to be if you have someone who's on that particular role, who's someone who's quite silent? Was he calming more in that situation? Was he comfortable in doing it? I think with the results, I think we can determine that maybe it wasn't really working out in that particular way. He was getting tanks in the fights. The supports seemed to be safe for majority of those EMPs, and Masterminds found the secret recipe in counter-engaging in that particular series, because I don't think Blank Blue looked very comfortable, and in their prime, they certainly did underperform in the situation, and Masterminds took advantage of it. I think in terms of just a one-to-one ratio, the player from Blank Blue, Anta, always says this, that in terms of a 1v1 matchup on every single player in Contenders, they have the best roster, which I agree with. And in terms of actually putting that to full use, I'm not sure how much their coaches are involved with, but looking at Masterminds, they have an incredibly stacked roster too. They have people who have been playing in the World Cup, and Kiki. You have Yuki. These guys are really, really good too. So it's not like if you're looking at a one-to-one roster, Masterminds are heavily downplayed in this, I feel, because they have a ridiculously stacked roster as well. And Color Hex absolutely popped off in this series with the Widowmaker, and due to that, Masterminds were able to carry it over the line because they looked a little bit more calm. They looked more collected than Blank Blue at the time, which I think is quite unique, because usually when we're looking at such a young roster, we're thinking, okay, these guys could choke on LAN, but previously when they did play LAN, they actually looked the best they've ever had, recently. But on this particular Contenders, they certainly didn't look on their prime. Of course, they have Anta in, new player, but it was unfortunate for Blank Blue in the end.
Well, I think the casters were saying that Blank Blue have all this coaching and all this sister team support from the Pacific Blank team, where maybe that's why they were pulling out these different strategies. They were maybe trying to practice it on their sister team, and then when they brought out to the big stage, it might have not had as much practice as they thought. But you always see these kind of strategies that you never see before coming out of these teams. They want to surprise people in the playoffs, but Blank Blue, unfortunately disappointing in the 3-1 series against Masterminds, where now this leads us to our finals, Masterminds versus Drop Bears, and this I think was first and second seed of Group B, Masterminds being the first seed, keep in mind. And this series ended in a crushing, super quick 4-0 in favor of the Drop Bears. Very quick game in this best of 7, by the way. After such an impressive performance after Blank Blue, Masterminds got crushed. So do you think this should have been closer compared to how the semifinals went, or were you confident in the Drop Bears because they had just taken down Darksided?
I think coming into this tournament that Darksided were certainly, in my opinion, the best team coming out. So if Drop Bears beat them, I had them probably taking this series quite handily, despite the form that Mastermind showed against Blank Blue, but I feel like that's more matchup based. I feel like within our scene, we're starting to have that sort of rock, paper, scissors sort of situation going on here, because we have certain teams maybe matching up against better than other teams would. We're having that nice rotation where, perhaps Team X could do better against, Team A. We have situations where play styles are clashing up against each other, and it's really good because usually we haven't really had that much of like a decisive identity for a lot of these teams, especially within the top four. They all usually play, relatively the same, but now we're seeing a lot more different matchups and styles clashing into each other, which makes for more diverse competitive Overwatch. Now, coming into this, as I said, I thought Drop Bears will certainly take this through. Masterminds are a team that looked gassed out, I think, as well. I don't think Masterminds were playing at their best in this final. They certainly did look very tired. Hex looked completely shut down throughout the whole series, considering what he just did against Blank Blue. And, talking about Blank Blue on a one-to-one matchup basis, these guys are incredibly stacked, but he couldn't do the same thing up against Drop Bears, because Drop Bears are quite similar to Blank Blue in that regard, that they are very, very incredibly aggressive, and when they do, catch out a loose rotation, they will immediately cut the tail off of a team. But the thing is, with Drop Bears, they are a team that's a little bit more well-rehearsed and practiced with the compositions that come out of their defaults. So, an example of that is with the Junkrat on Hollywood. They're not a somber one-trick team. They can play full dive. Billa has done a fantastic job with playing the Genji. Jordation has proved that he can perform on the Widowmaker. So this is a team that, sure, maybe they don't perhaps have the best roster on a one-to-one ratio in terms of players, but this team knows their chemistry in terms of the heroes that they do pick and knowing how to play it. So coming into this match, sure, Drop Bears are similar to Blank Blue, but Drop Bears have more answers than Blank Blue would against Masterminds, because they are more flexible, because they run more compositions that could perhaps give Masterminds an answer. And coming off the momentum, of course, Masterminds had to play a previous game. Drop Bears had a break. They had times to reevaluate themselves. This was the perfect storm for Drop Bears to take this out. It wasn't the most entertaining of finals, admittedly. I thought Drop Bears, pretty much, no offense to Masterminds, smashed them into the gutters. And Darksided versus Drop Bears, that could have
should have been the final.
Been the grand final, because that was an absolutely awesome series. So it was a shame overall, but congrats to Drop Bears in that regards.
Well, yeah, congratulations. That's no hit to Masterminds. Making it to the finals, you still get second place, but we would have expected something a little bit closer after taking down the Masters of Blank Blue. But for the final question, to wrap things up quickly, I always ask all my guests, because Contenders is all about showcasing the top talent or the upcoming talent of the Overwatch League. Everyone's getting scouted, and although Australia is kind of a long plane ride away from the closest Overwatch team, but Custom proved this wrong, so it's fine. But which players, in your opinion, could be picked up from the Overwatch League from Australia?
This is a hard question to answer in that regard. I feel like we have
so many
players with a lot of potential that I feel like if they're in an environment in America where they have, a bunch of coaches, a lot of money, infrastructure around them, you can really turn these guys into absolute monsters. Players who are doing something with our Australian team. We don't have as many resources as other countries do. That's no excuse, but that's just how the way it is. And I think a player that comes to mind, Quats from Drop Bears, is probably the best main tank we have. And I feel like main tank is a very important role that a lot of people definitely underrate. You look at, for example, Fisher coming over to Gladiators. That guy going into Gladiators made them, a bottom tier team to maybe even contesting the top. Having a good main tank can really swing the positions if you can work around that. And I think Quats is certainly that play. He's been in that roster for so long. And if this guy is in a very positive environment, and as soon as he got face into the coaching staff role, this guy really played in his prime form. And this guy's very young as well. He's only about 16, I believe.
Oh,
and
wow.
This guy is literally tearing every single main tank in Australia up. He's absolutely insane. So we have a lot of very young players with a lot of potential. You can pretty much make a debate for all of the Blank Blue members in that regard too. a lot of young players with a lot of talent, and that's why they got picked up. Blank, of course, Blank's a good organization for Australia, and that's why they ended up getting picked up from them. But we certainly do have experience as well. You have Termo, Yuki, who were previously in the World Cup. It's just all about performing at a consistent basis, and I think if we were to highlight who would to be an Overwatch League, I feel like we need a little bit more of a larger sample size in terms of LAN performance,
right?
Because a lot of teams do change on LAN, right? We haven't really had too many LANs in Australia. I think this is like our third in Overwatch, which is pretty ridiculous. So players who can get accustomed to that LAN environment transition their play styles online to the LAN clients in front of people who are watching. That's going to be the players who are going to be most impactful for Overwatch League, because it shows your tenacity, your confidence, and really that's what you really need coming into, if you want to be part of Overwatch League, you need confidence, experience, and that's what they certainly are going to value. So if you have consistent results, in fact, I would debate if we have a situation where we're having a constant team that continues to win contenders, then these players who are constantly performing, they're going to be given the wink. People are going to be trying to scout them. They're going to be trialed for certain teams, maybe on, a top tier American team for contenders or European, and they can get transitioned onto perhaps a roster in the Overwatch League as a substitution or whatever. They do in-house scrims, because that is what a lot of these Overwatch League teams are really liking at the moment, is to have a 12-man roster, so they can constantly in-house scrim to try and practice the new meta, especially with Brigade coming through. That's going to be so incredibly important, because you want to be practicing in-house so other teams don't know your strategies. You can have all these wonky and wacky things you can do without people knowing. So that's certainly going to be interesting coming into this. But we do have players who are on the horizon, but with more performances, more consistent performances, that's really going to aid them in getting picked up.
Right, and it's not just how many kills you can get on the kill feed, but your communication skills, how good of a teammate you can be, what role are you playing. You mentioned Quats, some players from Blank Blue, Termo and Yuki. Some of these players being underage, so you have to be 18 to be in the Overwatch League, so plenty of time to develop as a player and things like that. But that will wrap up our interview. Thank you so much, Racquet, for coming on.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being on the show, and a lot of people come on the show, like watching it as soon as it comes out all the time. I recommend everyone like the video down below. I'm doing your work here for now, Kiwi.
Yeah, you're promoting the video for me.
No, I'm joking.
Yeah, he's the new host, guys. He's the new host.
Yeah.
But that was Racquet, coach of Legacy, and you guys heard all about what you need to know for the Australian scene, and we're going to wrap things up. That was the finals. This was Racquet. This was Overwatch Contenders Daily, and we're going to see you guys on Wednesday.